A Bewitched Ship, a short story by W. Clark Russell. About 10 years ago, began my friend Captain Green, I went as second mate of a ship named the Ocean King. She'd been an old Indiaman in her time and had a poop and top-gallant forecastle, though alterations had knocked some of the dignity out of her. Her channels had been changed into plates with dead eyes above the rail, and the eye missed the spread of the lower rigging that it naturally sought in looking at a craft with a square stern and windows in it, and checkered sides rounding out into curves that made a complete tub of the old hooker. Yet, spite of changes, the old-fashioned grace would break through. She looked like a lady who has seen better days, who has got to do work which servants did for her in the times when she was well off, but who, let her set her hand to what she will, makes you see that the breeding and the instincts are still there, and that she's as little to be vulgarized by poverty and its coarse struggles as she could be made a truer lady than she is by money. Ships, like human beings, have their careers, and the close of some of them is strange, and sometimes hard, I think. The Ocean King had been turned into a collier, and I went second mate of her when she was full up with coal for a South African port. Yet this ship, that was now carrying one of the dirtiest cargoes you could name, barring phosphate manure, had been reckoned in her day a fine passenger vessel, a noble Indiaman indeed. Her tonnage was something over 1,100, with a cuddy fitted up royally. Many a freight of soldiers had she carried round the Cape, many an old nabob had she conveyed, aye, and Indian potentates, who smoked out of jewelled hookahs, and who were waited upon by crowds of black servants in turbans and slippers. I used to moralize over her just as I would over a tomb when I had the watch and was alone, and could let my thoughts run loose. The sumptuous cabin trappings were all gone, and I seemed to smell coal in the wind, even when my head was over the weather side, and when the breeze that blew along came fresh across 1,000 miles of sea. But there was a good deal of the fittings left, fittings which, I don't doubt, made the newspapers give a long account of this fine, great ship when she was launched, quite enough of them to enable a man to reconstruct a picture of the cuddy of the Ocean King as it was in the days of her glory, when the soft oil lamps shone bright on the draped tables and sparkled on silver and glass, when the old skipper, sitting with the mizzenmast behind him, would look, with his red face and white hair, down the rows of ladies and gentlemen, eating and drinking, stewards running about, trays hanging from the deck above, and globes full of gold, fish swinging to the roll of the vessel as she swung stately, with her stunsails hanging out over the long blue swell wrinkled by the wind. The ship is still afloat. Where are the people she carried? The crews who have worked her? The captains who have commanded her? There is nothing that should be fuller of ghosts than an old ship, and I very well remember that when I first visited the Victory at Portsmouth and descended into her cockpit, what I saw was not a well-preserved and cleanly length of massive deck, but groups of wounded and bleeding and dying men littering the dark floor, and the hatchway shadowed by groaning figures handed below, while the smell of English, French, and Spanish gunpowder even down there was so strong, phew, I could have spat the flavor out. Well, the old Ocean King had once upon a time been said to be haunted. She had certainly been long enough afloat to own 100 stories, and she was so stanch and true that if ever a superstition got into her, there was no chance of its getting out again. I only remember one of these yarns. It was told to me by the dockmaster, who had been at sea for many years, was an old man, and knew the history of all such craft as the Ocean King. He said that in '51, I think it was, there had been a row among the crew. An Italian sailor stabbed an Englishman who bled to death. To avenge the Englishman's death, the rest of the crew, who were chiefly English, thrust the Italian into the forepeak and let him lie there in darkness. When he was asked for, they reported that he had fallen overboard, and this seems to have been believed. Whether the crew meant to starve him or not is not certain. But after he had been in the forepeak 3 or 4 days, a fellow going behind the galley out of the way of the wind to light his pipe, it being then 4 bells in the first watch, came running into the forecastle with his hair on end and the sweat pouring off his face, swearing he had seen the Italian's ghost. This frightened the men prettily. Some of them went down into the forepeak and found the Italian lying there dead, with a score of rats upon him, which scampered off when the men dropped below. During all the rest of the voyage, his ghost was constantly seen, sometimes at the lee wheel, sometimes astride of the flying jibboom. What was the end of it? I mean, whether the men confessed the murder, and if so, what became of them, the dockmaster said he didn't know. But be this as it may, I discovered shortly after we had begun our voyage that the crew had got to hear of this story, and the chief mate said it had been brought aboard by the carpenter, who had picked it up from some of the dockyard labourers. I well recollect 2 uncomfortable circumstances. We sailed on a Friday, and the able and ordinary seamen were 13 in number, the idlers and ourselves aft, bringing up the ship's company to 19 souls, when I suppose in her prime the Ocean King never left port short of 70 or 80 seamen, not to mention stewards, cooks, cook's mates, butcher, butcher's mate, baker, and the rest of them. But double topsail yards were now in. Besides, I understood that the vessel's masts had been reduced and her yards shortened, and we carried stump fore and mizzen top gallant masts. All being ready, a tug got hold of our tow rope, and away we went down the river and out to sea. I don't believe myself that any stories which had been told the men about the ship impressed them much. Sailors are very superstitious, but they are not to be scared till something has happened to frighten them. Your merely telling them that there's a ghost aboard the ship they're in won't alarm them till they've caught sight of the ghost. But once let a man say to the others, "There's a bloomin' spirit in this ship. Lay your head agin the forehatch, and you'll hear him gnashing his teeth and rattling his chains." And then let another man go and listen and swear, and perhaps very honestly, that he heard the noises plain, and you'll have all hands in a funk, talking in whispers and going aloft in the dark nervously. In our ship, nothing happened for some days. We were deep and slow and rolled along solemnly, the sea falling away from the vessel's powerful round bows as from a rock. Pile what we could upon her, with tacks aboard, stay-sails drawing, and the wind hitting her best sailing point, we could seldom manage to get more than 7 knots out of her. One night I had the first watch. It was about 2 bells. There was a nice wind, sea smooth, and a red moon crawling up over our starboard beam. We were under all plain sail, leaning away from the wind a trifle, and the water washed along under the bends in lines through which the starlight ran glimmering. I was thinking over the 5 or 6 months' voyages which old wagons, after the pattern of this ship, took in getting to India, when, seeing a squall coming along, I sung out for hands to stand by the main royal and mizzen top-gallant halyards. It drove down dark, and not knowing what was behind, I ordered the main royal to be clewed up and furled. 2 youngsters went aloft. By the time they were on the yard, the squall thinned, but I fancied there was another bearing down, and thought it best to let the ordinary seaman roll the sail up. On a sudden down, they both trotted, hand over hand, leaving the sail flapping in the clutch of the clew lines. I roared out, "What do you mean by coming down before you've furled that sail?" They stood together in the main rigging, and one of them answered, "Please, sir, there's a ghost somewhere up aloft on the foretop sail yard." "A ghost, you fool," I cried. "Yes, sir," he answered. He says, "Jim, your mother wants you." I says, "What?" And he says, "Your mother wants you," in the hollowest of voices. Dick here heard it. "There's no one aloft forward, sir." I sung out to them to jump aloft again, and finding that they didn't move, I made a spring, on which they dropped like lightning on deck, and began to beg and pray of me in the eagerest manner not to send them aloft, as they were too frightened to hold on. Indeed, the fellow named Jim actually began to shiver and cry when I threatened him. So as the royal had to be furled, I sent an able seaman aloft, who, after rolling up the sail, came down and said that no voice had called to him, and that he rather reckoned it was a bit of skylarking on the part of the boys to get out of stowing the sail. However, I noticed that the man was wonderfully quick over the job, and that afterward the watch on deck stood talking in low voices in the waist. Jim was a fool of a youth, but Dick was a smart lad, aged about 19 and good-looking, with a lively tongue, and I heard afterward that he could spin a yarn to perfection all out of his imagination. I called him to me and asked him if he had really heard a voice, and he swore he had. "Did it say," said I, "Jim, your mother wants you?" "Aye, sir," he answered, with a bit of a shudder, "as plain as you yourself say it. It seemed to come off the foretop gallant yard, where I fancied I see something dark a-moving, but I was too frightened to take particular notice." Well, it was not long after this, about 11 o'clock in the morning, that, the captain being on deck, the cook steps out of the galley, comes walking along the poop, and going up to the skipper touches his cap and stands looking at him. "What do you want?" said the captain, eyeing him as if he took him to be mad. "Didn't you call, sir?" says the cook. "Call!" cries the skipper. "Certainly not." The man looked stupid with surprise and, muttering something to himself, went forward. 10 minutes after he came up again to the skipper and says, "Yes, sir," as a man might who answers to a call. The skipper began to swear at him and called him a lunatic and so on. But the man, finding he was wrong again, grew white and swore that if he was on his deathbed, he'd maintain that the captain had called him twice. The skipper, who was a rather nervous man, turned to me and said, "What do you make of this, Mr. Green? I can't doubt the cook's word. Who's calling him in my voice?" "Oh, it's some illusion, sir," said I, feeling puzzled for all that. But the cook, with the tears actually standing in his eyes, declared it was no illusion. He'd know the captain's voice if it was 9 miles off, and he then walked in a dazed way toward the forecastle, singing out that whether the voice he had heard belonged to a ghost or a Christian man, it might go on calling Cook for the next 20 years without his taking further notice of it. This thing, coming so soon after the call to Jim that had so greatly alarmed the 2 ordinary seamen, made a great impression on the crew. And I never regret anything more than that my position should have prevented me from getting into their confidence and learning their thoughts, for there is no doubt I should have stowed away memories enough to serve me for many a hearty laugh in after years. A few days rolled by without anything particular happening. One night it came to my turn to have the first watch. It was a quiet night, with wind enough to keep the sails still while the old ship went drowsily rolling along her course to the African port. Suddenly I heard a commotion forward, and fearing that some accident had happened, I called out to know what the matter was. A voice answered, "Ghost or no ghost, there's somebody a-talking in the forehold. Come and listen, sir." The silence that followed suggested a good deal of alarm. I sang out as I approached the men, "Perhaps there's a stowaway below." "It's no living voice," was the reply. "It sounds as if it comes from a skeleton." I found a crowd of men standing in awed postures near the hatch, and the most frightened of all looked to me to be the ordinary seaman Dick, who had backed away on the other side of the hatch and stood looking on, leaning with his hands on his knees and staring as if he were fascinated. I waited a couple or 3 minutes, which, in a business of this kind, seems a long time, and hearing nothing, I was going to ridicule the men for their nervousness when a hollow voice under the hatch said distinctly, "It's a terrible thing to be a ghost and not be able to get out. I was greatly startled and ran aft to tell the captain, who agreed with me that there must be a stowaway in the hold and that he had gone mad. We both went forward, and the hatch was lifted, and we looked on top of the coal. And I was then about to ask some of the men to join me in a search in the forepeak, for upon my word I had no taste single-handed for a job of that kind at such a moment, when the voice said, "There's no use looking. You'll never find me. I'm not to be seen." "Confound me!" cried the skipper, polishing his forehead with a pocket handkerchief. "If ever I heard of such a thing, I'll tell you what it is," he shouted, looking into the hatch. "Dead men can't talk, and so, as you're bound to be alive, you'd better come up out of that, and smartly too. Do you hear? Or you'll find this the worst attempt at skylarking that was ever made." There was a short silence, and you'd see all hands straining their ears, for there was light enough for that, given out by a lantern one of the men held. "You couldn't catch me because you couldn't see me," said the voice in a die-away tone, and this time it came from the direction of the main hatch, as though it had flitted aft. "Well," says the captain, "may I be jiggered," and without another word he walked away onto the poop. I told the men to clap the hatches on again, and they did this in double-quick time, evidently afraid that the ghost might pop up out of the hold if they didn't mind their eye. All this made us very superstitious, from the captain down to the boys. We talked it over in the cabin, and the mate was incredulous and disposed to ridicule me. "Anyway," said he, "it's strange that this voice is only heard in your watch. It's never favored me with any remarks. The creaking and groaning of an old wooden ship is often like spoken words, and what you've been hearing may be nothing but a deception of the ear." "A deception in your eye," cried the skipper. "The timbers of an old wooden ship may strain and creak in the Dutch language, but hang me if they ever talked good, sensible English. However, I'm not going to worry. For my part," said he, with a nervous glance around him, "I don't believe in ghosts. Whatever it is that's talking in the hold may go on jawing, so long as he sticks to that and don't frighten the men with an ugly mug, nor come upon us for a man's allowance." "If it's anybody's ghost," said I, "it must be the Italian's, the chap that was starved in the forepeak." "I doubt that," said the skipper. "I didn't detect anything foreign in what he said. To my ear, it sounded more like Whitechapel than Italiano." Well, for another week, we heard little more of the ghost. It's true that one middle watch, a chap I had sent aloft to loose the main royal, had hardly stepped out of the lower rigging after lingering in the cross-trees to overhaul his clew lines when he comes rushing up to me and cries out, "I've been hailed from aloft, sir." A voice has just sung out, "Tommy, jump aloft again, that I may have a good look at you." "Who's up there?" I asked him, staring into the gloom where the mast and yards went towering. "There's no one up there, sir, I'll swear it. I was bound to see him had anyone been there," he answered, evidently very much frightened. And it occurred to me that someone of the crew might be lying hid in the top, and that if I could catch him, I might find out who the ghost was. So I jumped into the rigging and trotted aloft, keeping my eye on the lee rigging to make sure that no one descended by it. I gained the top, but nobody was there. I mounted to the cross-trees, but the deuce a sign of anyone could I see. I came down, feeling both foolish and scared, for you see I had heard the voice myself in the hold. There was no question that there was a voice, belonging to nobody knew what, knocking about the ship, and consequently it was now impossible to help believing a man when he said he heard it. However, it was necessary to keep the men in heart, and this was not to be done by captain and mates appearing scared. So I reasoned a bit with the man, told him that there were no such things as ghosts, that a voice was bound to come from a live person, because a spectre couldn't possibly have lungs, those organs being of a perishable nature, and then sent him forward, but no easier in his mind, I suspect, than I was. Anyhow, I was glad when 8 bells struck, and it was my turn to go below. But as I have said, nothing much came of this. At least, nothing that reached my ears. But not many nights following the ship lay becalmed. There wasn't a breath of air, and the sea lay smooth as polished jet. This time, I had the middle watch again. I was walking quietly up and down the poop, on the lookout for a deeper shadow upon the sea to indicate the approach of wind, when a man came up the ladder and said, "There's someone a-talking to the ship under the bows." "Are you awake?" said I. "Heaven help me as I stand here, sir," exclaimed the fellow solemnly, "if that there voice which talked in the hold t'other day ain't now over the side." I ran forward and found most of the watch huddled together near the starboard cathead. I peered over, and there was a dead silence. "What are you looking over that side for?" "I'm here," said a thin, faint voice that seemed more in the air than in the sea. "There!" exclaimed one of the seamen in a hoarse whisper. "That's the third time. Whichever side we look, he's on the other." "But there must be someone in the water," said another man. "Anybody see his outline? Cuss me if I couldn't swear I see a chap swimming just now." "No, no," answered someone gruffly. "Nothing but phosphorus, Joe, and the right sort of stuff, too. For if this ain't old Nick—" "You're a liar, Sam," came the voice clear, and as one could swear, plain from over the side. There was a general recoil, and a sort of groan ran among the men. At the same moment, I collared a figure standing near me and slewed him round to bring his face fair to the starlight, clear of the staysail. "Come you along with me, Master Dick," said I, and I marched him off the forecastle along the main deck and up onto the poop. "So you're the ghost, eh?" said I. "Why, to have kept your secret, you should have given my elbow a wider berth. No wonder the voice only makes observations in my watch. You're too lazy, I suppose, to leave your hammock to try your wonderful power on the mate, eh?" "Now see here," said I, finding him silent, and noticing how white his face glimmered to the stars. "I know you're the man, so you'd better confess. Own the truth, and I'll keep your secret, providing you belay all further tricks of the same kind. Deny that you're the ghost, and I'll speak to the captain and set the men upon you." This fairly frightened him. "Well, sir, it's true. I'm the voice, sir, but for God's sake keep the secret, sir. The men UD have my life if they found out that it was me as scared them." This confession was what I needed, for though when standing pretty close to him on the forecastle, I could have sworn that it was he who uttered the words which perplexed and awed the sailors, yet so perfect was the deception, so fine, in short, was his skill as a ventriloquist, that, had he stoutly denied and gone on denying that he was the voice, I should have believed him, and continued sharing in the wonder and superstition of the crew. I kept his secret as I promised, but somehow or other it leaked out in time that he could deceive the ear by apparently pitching his voice among the rigging, or under the deck, or over the side, though the discovery was not made until the ghost had for a long time ceased to trouble the ship's company, and until the men's superstitious awe had faded somewhat, and they had recovered their old cheerfulness. We then sent for Dick to the cabin, where he gave us a real entertainment as a ventriloquist, imitating all sorts of animals and producing sounds as of women in distress and men singing out for help in the berths. Indeed, such was the skill that I'd often see the skipper and mate turning startled to look in the direction whence the voices proceeded. He made his peace with the men by amusing them in the same way, so that, instead of getting the ropes ending aft and the pummeling forward which he deserved, he ended as a real and general favourite, and one of the most amusing fellows that a man ever was shipmate with. I used to tell him that if he chose to perform ashore, he was sure to make plenty of money, since such ventriloquial powers as his was the rarest thing in the world, and I'd sometimes fancy he meant to take my advice. But whether he died or kept on going to sea, I don't know, for after he left the ship, I never saw nor heard of him again.